We can move on with our first panel. The panel's title is Proto-Populism and Early Populism in Constitutional History. And there are 3 papers to present here by Angus Brown, by Mikkel Flohr, and by Maria Tzanakopoulou. We begin with Mr. Angus Brown. Angus is a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge. He works on political and intellectual history and democratic theory, and his research focuses on the separation of powers in the 18th century America. His paper's title is Preserving the People's Constitution, the Pennsylvania Council of Censors, and the Populist Constitutionalism of the Early American Revolution. Angus.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. And thank you for having me at what I'm sure is set to be a fantastic conference on a really, really timely topic. And it remains a timely issue, if one that has become slightly commonplace in academic and political discussions. As we are, I'm sure, all aware, there's a certain common interpretation of the relationship between populism and constitutionalism, which I hope somewhat to challenge today. On this view, populism and constitutionalism are presented as inextricably opposed. For proponents of that view, where populism might seek to empower the unfettered will of the people or the demos, even against the rights of minorities, individual liberty, and the rule of law, constitutionalism offers a necessary institutional remedy. For these thinkers, by curtailing the power of elected leaders, constitutionalism serves as a check upon the power of the people, and acting as a higher law on which the state is founded, enforced by a politically impartial judiciary, may thus legitimately limit democratic power in the interest of its preservation. And this view of constitutional government is usually taken as one of the American Revolution's most important contributions to modern politics. Hamilton, Madison, and Jay are particularly credited with having first outlined a new theory of government in which, on Bruce Ackerman's terms, the people bind themselves by authoring a constitution designed to preserve their liberties at the expense of limiting their power. And thus, we're sometimes told, it was precisely in order to counter the power of the people, channeled by a populist demagogue or a proto-Caesar, as Hamilton put it, that the American founders framed the counter-majoritarian elements of their constitution, including the Supreme Court. But I think that this narrative ignores a very crucial episode in the development of early American constitutionalism, which really ought to prompt a reevaluation of the story of the relationship between constitutionalism and populism. And that was the debate on the 1776 Pennsylvania Constitution and the proposal contained within it for the creation of a Council of Censors, which was, in effect, a kind of radically democratic constitutional guardian whose origins predate the birth of the modern US Supreme Court by over a decade. So I hope to make the case for taking the Pennsylvania Constitution seriously as modern constitutionalism's point of origin, from which we can learn a great deal in seeking to resolve what many see as a contemporary crisis of constitutional politics. As I hope to show today, the development of the doctrine of the Constitution as a higher law, which can be enforced against the actions of the ordinary constituted powers, shouldn't be seen as being derived from either the august halls of the 1787 Convention, or from the writers of the Federalist, or even from esteemed writers like Adams and Jefferson, but instead should be recognized as the product of a heavily contested debate in the early days of the Republic, with the idea of the modern Constitution originating in the populism of the Pennsylvania radicals of 1776. Now, Pennsylvania turned only quite late to the writing of its 1776 Constitution during the Revolution. By the time its first convention had been elected, the Declaration of Independence had already been signed for a week, and New Hampshire, South Carolina, Virginia, and New Jersey had already adopted new constitutions. When Pennsylvania did adopt a new constitution, however, it adopted what is generally regarded as the most radical of the state constitutions, with a unicameral legislature, a weak plural executive, and a judiciary reselected septennially and significantly beholden to legislative power. The capstone of this radicalism was the creation of a new institution termed the Council of Censors, a constitutional guardian elected by universal suffrage, with broad powers to maintain the subordination of the branches of government to the Constitution. Thus, as the 47th article of that Constitution outlined, in order that the freedom of the Commonwealth may be preserved inviolate forever, there shall be chosen by a ballot by the freemen in each city and county respectively in every 7th year, 2 persons in each city and county of this state, to be called the Council of Censors, whose duty it shall be to inquire whether the Constitution has been preserved inviolate in every part, and whether the legislative and executive branches of government have performed their duty as guardians of the people, or assumed to themselves or exercised other or greater powers than they are entitled to by the Constitution. In order to fulfill that duty, the censors were granted some very broad powers, including the power to subpoena officials and documents, to recommend the striking down of unconstitutional laws, and to order impeachments for a year after their election. But they were also given the authority to call a new constitutional convention after every one of their septennial meetings, with the hope that if the constitution need be amended, it would be done so by defaulting it to the people. And it was particularly important that this body had no authority to alter the constitution itself. The intended function of this body remains quite a heated topic of debate in the scholarly literature. For some scholars like Bernard Bailyn and M.J.C. Weil, the Constitution in Pennsylvania and the Council of Censors were more or less an attempt to create a pure separation of powers as an alternative to the now more famous system of checks and balances with a bicameral legislature and a unitary executive wielding a veto over legislation. But some other historians have taken a much more negative approach to the council. For Gordon S. Wood, for example, the censors represented nothing less than a monster pulled out of Roman history. And he argues that the body should be best seen as a terrible echo of the censorial institutions of the totalizing ancient republics, Rome, but also Athens and Sparta to some degree. And nor is Wood's verdict particularly unusual, because the Council of Censors has most often been portrayed by historians either as the product of the antiquarian fantasies of a clique of naive classical republicans, or as a tool by which the Constitution's authors, the Radical Party in Pennsylvania, cynically upheld an unpopular constitution to maintain themselves in power. But I think that this interpretation has tended to rest upon a false attribution of the censor's creation to the Irish-born Philadelphia radical leader, George Bryan, who you can see on the screen now, based on basically entirely an unevidenced attribution of a pamphlet which proposed a similar institution, as well as some very long retrospective memoirs. Instead, following the research of the historian A.O. and Aldridge, I believe that the true inspiration for the Council of Censors lay in an anonymous pamphlet entitled 4 Letters on Interesting Subjects, whose true author was not an unknown pamphleteer or lawyer, as is sometimes supposed, but in fact the very famous Thomas Paine. This pamphlet proposed the creation of a decennially elected provincial jury, whose functions were almost identical to those of the Council of Censors. And whilst no records exist of the Pennsylvania Convention, we know that Paine was intimately connected to some of the Constitution's authors, particularly Timothy Matlack and James Young. By reading this pamphlet, I think we can therefore see the major inspiration for the first proposal for an elected constitutional guardian in the American Revolution, and to some degree establish the intended purpose of this body. The true purpose of the Council of Censors lay in a new distinction between constitution and government, which lay at the heart of Paine's proposal for the provincial jury. As the 4 letters argued, a constitution and a form of government are frequently confounded together, whereas they are not only different, but established for different purposes. Anticipating Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès' theory of a distinction between constituent and constituted powers, Paine argued that whereas the form of government represented the institutional arrangements of the state, the Constitution represented the charter by which the people created that government and placed limitations upon it, detailing the extent and limits of political power beyond which political institutions dare not step. Thus, he argued, whilst all countries have some form of government, few or perhaps none have truly a constitution. Like Sayers, moreover, Paine argued that the constitution was not a contract by which the people united into a nation, but a charter issued by a people which existed both temporally and legally prior to the creation of the government. Thus, the constitution belonged to the people and was there to alter or abjure as the ultimate source of power in a political community. That this pamphlet was the first example of a clear distinction between constitutional and ordinary law in the American Revolution, as well as of the means of enforcing that distinction, was already noted by Bernard Bailyn and Gordon Wood decades ago. But I think that in their case, a quite parochial focus on American history led them to ignore the extent to which this represented a rather important revolution in global constitutional thinking. And that was because, whether by accident or by design, Paine had stumbled across the idea of the Constitution as not as a set of fundamental freedoms inherited from the past, or as a framework for the government, which had dominated constitutional thinking before the Revolution, and instead began to present an idea of the Constitution as the embodiment of the will of the community. So, whilst a writer like Lord Bolingbroke, writing 40 years before the American Revolution, could describe a constitution as the assemblage of laws, institutions, and customs derived from certain fixed principles of reason that compose the general system according to which the community hath agreed to be governed, the four letters reconceptualize the Constitution as the embodiment of the people's sovereign power, a means by which their will could continually control the actions of the government without having to be continuous in its exercise. And it was on this basis that Joseph de Maistre claimed that Paine had entirely departed from the entire history of European constitutional thought in his 1791 Considerations on France. We might now ask ourselves what the cause of this revolution in constitutional thinking was. One answer might be that it was simply a stroke of brilliance on Paine's part. And whilst I wouldn't deny that Paine was a brilliant and innovative constitutional thinker, I think the congruence of similar ideas amongst several distinct authors in the same period suggests that it should instead be attributed to a broader shift, a broader political shift inaugurated by the American Revolution. In particular, the new theory of constitutionalism, which appeared first in this pamphlet, but was soon articulated across the 13 colonies, arose out of the American colonists' break with what is often seen as the traditional Whig account of the English Constitution, as a perpetual antagonism between a parliament, which would serve as the guardian of the Constitution, the popular will, and the people's liberties, and a corrupt crown constantly trying to destroy that liberty. Instead, they now turned to a dual critique of both Parliament and King as potential tyrants. Now, again, as Gordon Wood has argued, owing to their experience in the Stamp Act crisis and a wider concern with parliamentary tyranny, American patriots came to view the British Constitution rather differently and recognized that Parliament too could abridge the Constitution. As the four letters therefore put it, next to the forming of a good constitution is the means of preserving it. If once the legislative power breaks in upon it, the effect will be the same as if a kingly power did. The Constitution, in either case, will receive its death wound. Which is to say, once legislatures had become ascendant with the decline of royal authority beginning in the 18th century, it had become clear that legislatures too could be agents of political oppression, and that if the will of the people embodied in the Constitution were to be preserved, it would have to be by limiting both legislative and executive power. And of course, this constitutional doctrine demanded the means of its enforcement against ordinary political institutions. This obviously is quite a familiar story to anyone with even a passing knowledge of modern constitutionalism. But the idea found in the four letters and the Pennsylvania Constitution as to how to guarantee the supremacy of the Constitution is quite different to the judicialized model to which we are used today. Instead of a constitutional court, they created the Council of Censors, an elective body whose duty went beyond the mere arbitration of disputes around legal constitutionality to include defending each branch of the Constitution from the others, overturning abuses of power, and the removal from office of politicians who threaten the Constitution, although of course some constitutional courts do possess these powers today. In doing so, the Pennsylvania Constitution, however, also ensured that the power to enforce the Constitution would always remain in the hands of the people. Constitutional surveillance would not be undertaken by judges appointed by the legislature or executive serving for life terms, but by the people's extraordinary representatives, regularly renewed and elected by universal suffrage. And nor would this constitution entail a static limit upon the will of the people, as some modern constitutions have come to, because, like many other 18th century thinkers, including Jefferson and Condorcet, the authors of this constitution believed that in order to prevent the will of the dead or historic people from limiting the political possibilities of the present, the constitution would have to be regularly revised and reauthorized. So instead of seeking to establish limits on popular power, this constitutional doctrine sought to enshrine the will of the people, and specifically did so in anti-elitist terms, representing a populist constitutional doctrine, which might offer one way by which we can reconsider our own constitutional woes. The model of the Council of Censors found very few friends in the young American Republic. In the Federalist Papers, Madison decried it as an ineffective instrument for the maintenance of mere parchment barriers, in his terms, to abuses of power, and instead preferred a system of checks and balances. This was somewhat ironic, because Madison had himself in 1787 proposed a council of revision composed of the president and Supreme Court justices, whose duty it would be to veto unconstitutional legislation passed by Congress. For Morris, the creation of such a body represented the institution of an unnecessary confusion of the legislative separation of powers and the potential tyranny of judges in the legislative order. In fact, in the earliest days of the American Republic, it was not in fact clear that any guardian of the Constitution existed at all, although, as Morris argued, this role was sometimes attributed to the president, and of course Alexander Hamilton famously suggested it ought to be the Supreme Court. And it was largely on the basis of Hamilton's arguments in Federalist Number 78 that the United States Supreme Court eventually filled this lacuna, and this is a role in which it persists, although not without controversy. And it's on this note that I think we should return to the clash between constitutionalism and populism with which I began, and the role that Pennsylvania's Council of Censors might play in navigating a path between the two. So that there is something irreconcilable about the relationship between populism and constitutionalism has become one of the commonplaces of contemporary debates, as I've already said. On one version of this story, it is populism, with its Manichaean focus on the purity of the people's will and the corruption of elite political institutions, which is to blame. I think on another and perhaps more useful recent retelling, championed by Martin Lachlan in his recent book Against Constitutionalism, it is precisely the limits on the people's will placed by constitutions which have spurred the crisis of legitimacy now engulfing many constitutional democracies. And viewed in this light, we might best see populism not necessarily as an alien threat to liberal democracy and constitutional government, but as a product of constitutionalism's attack on the sovereignty of the people and its reification of judicial power. Similar arguments have been forwarded by Samuel Moyn and Ryan Dorfler, both in the popular press and in their academic work. And for these writers, the invocation of populism as a threat to constitutional democracy gets the story the wrong way round. Instead, they present populism as the backlash to the erosion of popular power entailed by a rising juristocracy. And for all three, the response to this crisis appears necessarily to be the paring back of the scope of constitutionalism, which then appears to cash out in a return to what is often called legicentrism in Europe following French authors. But I think that the Council of Censors might offer us an alternative path which preserves the role of the guardian of the Constitution and a strong constitutional jurisdiction, but returns this power to the hands of the people through the institution of a popularly elected constitutional guardian composed of the extraordinary representatives of the people, elected for short terms by universal suffrage and tempered by regular constitutional revision. Indeed, it was central to the idea of the Council of Censors in 1776 that the people would remain supreme even after they instituted a representative government and elected those who would administrate it. Representation would thus not then entail the alienation of popular sovereignty or the right to amend the constitution, but would merely be a form of the delegation of certain limited powers. If we were to reimagine how constitutional control was exerted with this Council of Censors in mind, it might thus be possible to return to the Paynian ideal of the constitution as a limit on elite power, rather than as a defense against excesses of democracy. And I think that by returning to constitutionalism's radical roots, we might therefore find the intellectual tools with which to reform our constitutions to meet the challenges constitutional democracy faces today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angus. That was most interesting, and I'm very confident that it will provoke a very lively discussion. If you add me one remark now, I could also tell that this is very much in line with Larry Kramer's understanding of American revolutionary constitutionalism. We'll talk about that later. We proceed with our second paper presented by Dr. Mikkel Flohr. I understand that Mikkel Flohr is on the window of Allan Dreyer, right? Okay. Mikkel's Mikkel is a postdoctoral fellow at the Roskilde University of Denmark. He works on social and political theory, philosophy, and the history of ideas, and his research focuses on the conceptualization of the people in democracy and its relation with populism. His paper's title is The Proto-Populist Origins of Danish Democracy Towards a Conceptual History of the People, folket, in the Constitutional Struggles in Denmark, 1830 to 1920. Mikkel.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and sorry for the excessively long title. Sure we can somehow blame German influence there. So yeah, I should probably start with a little bit of an apology, as is almost customary. I have promised more than I can actually deliver on, and for the sake of brevity, I've decided to cut the story somewhat short, around 1901. But I'll be more than happy to expand on what happened in the remaining 19 years in the Q&A if anyone is interested. And I should also have let's see, here's some slides that I can share. Yes. There you go. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, go. Apologies, we're just having an obligatory technical issues here.
Hvordan man får den til at blive... Det er ikke nede i bunden. Er det nede i bunden? Jo, det kan du krysse for. Hvad for noget? Ja, træk den der bjælke. Sorry. Jeg prøver at trykke det. F5. Det er effekt. Det er en helt forkert effekt.
Sorry. So I'm just gonna push on here while we try and work out there is no
the online.
Yeah. I
think we made it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And the next one already.
Yeah. You will go ahead and just slides. So yes, I will start with some conceptual clarifications, namely the question of what is populism. And the majority of the literature is beginning to converge finally on 2 points in regards to what populism is. First of all, a definition of populism as politicians, parties, and movements that promote unitary ideas of the people and a general will, politically and morally counterposed to elites and other groups. And secondly, populism is also commonly conceived as a reaction to or a response to liberal democracy. Critics such as Jan Werner Müller and Nacho Benazzi consider it a parasite, an enemy, or a disfigurement of liberal democracy, whereas adherents such as Ernesto McLeod and others consider it a possible corrective. Now, I agree with the initial point and will rely on this definition of populism to identify proto-populist movements throughout the Danish constitutional struggles. And notice here that I use the prefix proto-populism occasionally in order to highlight that these actors did not use the term themselves, but not to suggest that it isn't an instance of populism according to these definitions. I remain somewhat more lukewarm or critical of the second point, i.e. that populism only emerged in response to liberal democracy. In fact, I will try to show that these proto-populist movements preceded, fought for, and attained democracy in Denmark. This suggests that the relationship between populism and liberal democracy is a lot more complex than some of these critics assume, that they're not necessarily separate or inherently opposed, and that they may in fact be compatible and potentially even complementary in certain instances. So let's see here. Yeah, we'll hold on the next slide for a while. I'm just double checking here, but my paper reconstructs and analyzes the conceptual history of the people, or folket, and its role in the struggle for an establishment of parliamentary democracy in modern Danish history. It provides a historical and discursive analysis of the constitution, development, let me just see here, and central role that proto-populist concepts of the people played in the constitutional struggle between 1830 and 1901 that transformed the Kingdom of Denmark from an absolute monarchy into a parliamentary democracy. I show how these struggles shaped and were shaped by a series of proto-populist conceptions of the people as an independent political subject, politically and morally counterposed to reigning political elites and institutions that empowered them, which in turn shaped the conceptualization and constitution of democracy and as the people's rule, or folkestyre, in Denmark. My paper thereby challenges contemporary arguments about the supposedly adverse relationship between populism and liberal democracy by showing how proto-populist conceptions of the people preceded and shaped Danish democracy over and above constitutional measures. And I will now turn to look at the semantic development of the concept of the people. So in medieval times, there's no concept of the people denoting the entire populace in its own right. The term people, or folk, was primarily used in a domestic context to denote a group of individuals subject to a specific patriarchal authority. Although it could also be extended in an analogous manner to describe the subjects of the king or god. In the 18th century, the concept, however, developed a number of new meanings, or achieved them from literature coming in from other places, which all had distinctly normative dimensions that can be grouped into sort of three primary clusters that often overlap in practice. So there's a political concept of the people, which denoted a political community of citizens, irrespective of language or class, united under the king's authority and laws. This was inspired by contemporary natural law and contract theories, where the people figured as the foundation and legitimation of political power. Secondly, there was a romantic nationalist concept of the people that had its origin with German thinkers such as Johann Gottfried Fichte, who conceived the people as a sort of originary linguistic and cultural community, or a nation, which was the basis of its subsequent political unification and organization. And finally, there was a third social concept of the people, which designated the lower and excluded classes, which also constituted the majority of the population. It was primarily identified with the peasantry and the commoners. This concept of the people was most closely related to the medieval category designating social and political subjects, although it also diverged in some central respects. So the initial political conception of the people was promoted by the absolute state from the middle of the 18th century in order to legitimize the monarchy and unite the multinational state under its authority. This also provided the liberal opposition that emerged after the introduction of regional estates assemblies in the mid-1830s, with a language in which they could express their liberal and constitutional aspirations without directly or provoking the absolute state. The opposition primarily oriented itself towards a national romantic conception of the people, originary community united by language and history, which constituted the nation of the monarchy and the state. This formed the basis of their demands for a free constitution and the incorporation of the Duchy of Schleswig in the Kingdom of Denmark proper. The free constitution was to involve the constitutional limitation of the king and his ministers' powers, some sort of representative assembly with influence on legislation, taxation, and state finances, as well as the rule of law and civil liberties, ideally. Yes, so in March of 1848, the so-called National Liberal Opposition organized a number of mass meetings that culminated in the so-called People's Procession to deliver a petition to the king at Christiansborg Palace. The petition was formulated in the name of the people, which was used interchangeably with nation and Denmark. This had become the primary discursive figure of legitimacy at this point in time. The petition declared, and I quote, "The advices that your majesty has inherited from your predecessor are not trusted by the people," and went on to demand a new government that could save Denmark's honor and institute the country's freedom. End of quote. And this, of course, referred to a new national liberal government that would unite Schleswig with the rest of Denmark under a free constitution. The petition also concluded with a warning, and I quote, "We implore your majesty not to drive us to desperate measures of self-help," end quote. But this threat of revolution proved unnecessary. King Frederick VII informed the delegates delivering the petition that he had already dismissed his government and commented, quote, "When you, gentlemen, have the same confidence in your king that I have in my people, I will be a true leader in honor and freedom," end quote, illustrating the hegemony of the people as the source of political legitimacy and the comparative strength of the National Liberals. The following day, a National Liberal government was formed, and the king instructed them formally to prepare elections for a constituent assembly. The resulting June Constitution of 1849 is often conceived retrospectively in terms of the subsequent development towards parliamentary democracy. However, this is somewhat misleading. While it was a major democratic advance over absolutism, it did not establish a democracy as such. The June Constitution established a constitutionally delimited monarchy, where the king appointed government and legislative capacities were shared between the king and a bicameral parliament, known as Rigsdagen. It was constructed on the model of a mixed constitution with an indirectly elected upper chamber, Landstinget, or the assembly of the country, composed of older members of the economic elite, functioning as a form of aristocracy, which was supposed to act as a moderating influence on the potential popular excesses of the directly elected lower chamber, the folket, or the assembly of the people. The June Constitution was generally conceived as a victory of the people, which became the central figure of Danish political discourse in this period. The conception of the people championed by the National Liberals between 1830 and 1848 was populist before it became the hegemonic self-conception of the political community in the following period. It was first and foremost conceived in national romantic terms, defined by Danish language and identity, and in opposition to German peoples and states, an antagonism that was furthered by the secession of Schleswig and Holstein in 1848, the following civil war, and the intervention of the German Confederation. This national romantic conception of the people was at first politically and morally counterposed to the government of the absolute state and, at times, the entire governmental form of the absolute monarchy, but rarely the king as such, in line with predominant natural law theories and continued popular reverence for the king, which was only increased by a speedy accommodation of the National Liberals in March and cemented during the subsequent war. Now, in 1864, Denmark suffered a major defeat in the Second Schleswig War, which led to the adoption of the revised Constitution of 1866. It introduced economically privileged franchise in the indirect elections for the upper chamber of parliament, which were supplemented by a number of royal appointments. This upper chamber consequently came to be dominated by a large number of landowners and members of the economic and political elite, who also made up the majority of all governments appointed by the conservative King Christian IX up until 1901, while the popularly elected lower chamber, dominated by representatives of the peasants and commoners who made up the majority of the population, were de facto excluded from any meaningful political influence. In 1870, a group of them formed the United Left to contest this constitutional class divide and fight for what they refer to as the people's self-rule, which they explained referred to parliamentarism, by which they meant government formed on the basis of the composition of the popularly elected lower chamber of parliament, the folket. The concept of the people's self-rule or people's rule is roughly the colloquial synonym of democracy, which, however, was a controversial and divisive concept at this point in time, whereas the people was accepted across the political spectrum. The basis of the left's project was variously presented as being the people's inherent moral right to self-rule and or the prior June Constitution in a very strange and mistaken form of constitutional revisionism. The left party's discourse centered on the people and its self-rule. Their concept of the people came from the influential Grundtvigian part of the movement and was fundamentally national romantic, but also had a social dimension insofar as he was primarily identified with the peasants and commoners. Moreover, it was conceived as independent of, if not opposed to, both state and government, shaped by the left's extended period in opposition and liberal ideology. The United Left achieved an absolute majority in the elections for the lower chamber in 1872 and asked the king to appoint a government reflecting this outcome. They were swiftly rebuked by the king with reference to his constitutionally guaranteed right to appoint government as he saw fit. And in 1875, he appointed the arch-conservative landowner and sworn opponent of parliamentary democracy, Estrup, as prime minister, a role that he would continue to serve in for the next 20 years. In 1883, the Left Party began to block government legislation, including the budget, in the lower chamber, but were eventually bypassed to the use of provisional legislation. The Left Party decried these dictatorial measures and mobilized their supporters, as did the government. The Danish historian Mikkel Flohr has recently documented and analyzed the extensive popular mobilizations during this period and characterizes particularly the period between 1885 and 88 as a popular breakthrough. And I quote, "Danes had in earnest become a modern and active demos, which understood itself as being a political subject, and which the country's governments and parliamentarians had in the future to take into account." End quote. While these mobilizations did not immediately result in victory for either side or major changes, the pressure that they created was the basis of the settlement reached by moderates in 1894 to end Estrup's reign and the use of provisional legislation, as well as the system change in 1901, where the king finally gave up and began appointing governments in accordance with the absolute majority in the lower chamber, corresponding to the Left Party's initial vision of the people's self-rule, which is today consistently conceptualized as either the people's rule or democracy. Here it is important to note that this remained an informal and incoherent practice that was not codified until 1983. 53, in paragraph 15, in the form of negative parliamentarism for a number of reasons. Meanwhile, Danish democracy was ensured by a shared conception of the people's right to self-rule, as well as their capacity and willingness to assert it through popular mobilizations, if need be, rather than any constitutional measures, as would become clear in the Easter crisis of 1920, where the king dismissed the government and the Social Democrats took to the streets in the name of the people's rule. Now, the popular mobilizations during the constitutional struggle supported and furthered the Left Party's conceptualization of the people as a collective actor independent of and opposed to both state and government. This proto-populist notion of the people also reshaped the notion of democracy and as the people's self-rule, subsequently shortened to the people's rule, which became the predominant vernacular conceptualization of democracy from the turn of the century and onwards. The people's self-rule was first and foremost used to describe parliamentary democracy as a constitutional form conceived in terms of the people, as opposed to the reigning economic and political elites, ruling from the bottom up through the election of representatives to folket. the lower chamber of parliament, who would in turn appoint and dismiss government. But to many of its adherents, it also carried connotations of a certain authority and capacity for self-determination cultivated in and by the people themselves, that was separate from and ought to be superior to the institutions of the state and government. This found its foremost expression in the popular movement fighting for democracy, commonly referred to within the opposition simply as the democracy. The people's self-rule, in other words, came to imply not only that the people ought to rule through the mediated election of government by representatives in the lower chamber, but also much more fundamentally through the determination of the form of government itself. While the left party continued to invoke the June Constitution, this distinctive understanding of the people and its self-rule as a form of constituent power shaped by the Convivian movement and the popular mobilizations and political struggles of this period supplanted liberal and constitutional ideas to become the primary ideological basis of the establishment of parliamentary democracy in Denmark. At this point, I think we move on to this wonderful image, which I thought was going to be, well, I've already started on the conclusions, but I suppose we'll do the questions later. But yeah, that concludes my talk for now. I'll be more than happy to answer any questions subsequently.
Thank you very much, Mikkel. That was quite something that you have done, although it was a bit too much information for such a short time frame. You managed to present us something like a blitz lecture on Danish constitutional history. And I have to say that the Nordic political and constitutional history is not very well known in the rest of Europe, and it is always very instructive and very welcome to learn about it. We'll have the opportunity to discuss further in the discussion part. I proceed now with our third and last paper for this panel and for today, from Dr. Maria Tzanakopoulou. And please allow me to take the opportunity here to apologize for the gender misrepresentation in our workshop. It is not something that hasn't troubled us. Anyway, Maria is a lecturer at the Birkbeck School of Law of the University of London. She specializes in public law and European law, and I should tell that she has some very innovative publications on constitutionalism. The title of her paper is Populism and Patriotism, Lessons from English Constitutional History. Maria.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much to the organizers of this really nice workshop. I have to admit, I feel the burden of the previous speakers on my shoulders, kind of, because, you know, there are many resonances, of course, with what previous people said, but I also follow pretty different directions. So I need to put my thoughts to sort of get my thoughts together. Now, unlike the previous speakers, I unfortunately don't have any slides. So you're going to have to make do with my face, I guess, for the next 20 minutes or so. I apologize for that. It's going to be speaking only. Now, like I said, there are many resonances with previous speakers and what I'll say today, but I'll follow a pretty different direction. I argue something that I think Angus also alluded to, that populist constitutionalism is a kind of an oxymoron. It is a contradiction in terms, because constitutionalism and populism are concepts that rest on mutually contradictory premises. Constitutionalism centers kind of around the idea of consensus, and populism centers around the idea of conflict. What I will try to prove with some examples from English history is that English radical workers' movements from the 17th century onwards, movements that would have definitely been criticized as populist today, were actually much more constitutionalism oriented, indeed much more patriotic constitutionalism oriented in many instances, and much less populism oriented than is sometimes assumed. And I'm going to try and argue that this was not necessarily an ideal choice from the point of view of the politics that they represented, from the point of view of, their radical emancipatory politics. And why is that so? I'm going to argue that if politics is contained within constitutional thought and practice, then it ceases to be politics altogether because it loses its ability to generate rupture. And this was a kind of menace for radical workers' movements in English history. Now, just to clarify the theoretical background that I'm going to be using very quickly, I don't want to tire the audience with that. In the unlikely event that people have not realized that already, as far as populism is concerned, I draw quite heavily on the tradition of Laclau, and as regards my understanding of politics, I draw quite heavily on the tradition of French philosopher Jacques Rancière. Now, populism can obviously be defined and interpreted in various ways. Every speaker has said that in the tradition of Laclau, populism is interpreted as consisting of mainly two elements. One is the identification of the leadership of the populist group with the people. And the other element is a focus on an antagonism, on a conflict between the people and the establishment. Now, there's nothing inherently bad in this concept, except perhaps that it seeks to reduce political conflict to a kind of binary representation between them and us. And political conflict is always a little more complicated than that. But I don't want to focus on this reduction. I want to focus instead on the fact that populism is a practice or a rhetoric that does nevertheless focus on conflict. And this focus on conflict is important because it attacks directly the logic of consensus that I think has been dominating the liberal constitutional tradition. Why can consensus be a problematic thing? In the theoretical sort of strand and tradition that I'm using, consensus, this sort of, desire for a fully reconciled society, for a society without politics, this is a basically oppressive idea because it rules out the possibility of change. Now, for constitutionalism, consensus is a key term precisely because it rules out the possibility of change, precisely because it is apolitical. Where most of us are constitutionalists here, I'm pretty sure we all know that it's commonplace in the context of constitutionalism to argue that, the job of the constitution is to withdraw certain topics from political confrontation, to sort of depoliticize them. And so we can say that the constitution is the mechanism of consensus par excellence in a way. Now, if the constitution is about building consensus and populism is about disrupting consensus, then it transpires that, according to this reading at least, that constitutional populism or populist constitutionalism is probably a contradiction in terms. Now, for Laclau and his tradition, if we dismiss populism, we dismiss politics altogether. And conversely, if we filter politics through constitutional argument, we silently agree that the management of communities should be a concern for administrative powers or for kind of higher juridical authorities, which distribute the exercise of power once and for all to those who are supposed to exercise power and to those who are supposed to be subject to it. And I'm arguing that this is the opposite of politics because politics is rupture with everything that is considered sensible. Rancière says it's disidentification, it's abandonment of everything that's considered a given. It's abandonment, for example, of any constitutional assumption about who should exercise power and who should be subject to it. Now, I think that English history of, among other things, radical worker movements exemplifies many of the above kind of elements and shows that this entrapment of politics into constitutional argument did not in the end help those oppressed and those disadvantaged subvert established interests. The first example that I'm going to use is from the English Civil War. We're talking about the mid-1600s. And I'm going to talk about the Levelers, a radical group within the revolutionary camp of the English Civil War. We call them sometimes the revolution within the revolution. And I'm using them as an example because even they found it difficult to sort of escape from the limited political contingency that was dictated by the English constitutional heritage. Now, these guys had some very radical ideas, such as, for example, that popular sovereignty could be external and even contrary to parliamentary will. For the period that we're talking about, this was a formidable idea. It was an idea that lay far outside what the law could conceive. And so it's precisely these radical elements of their political vision, in the specific historical context, of course, that make them a most compelling case of constitutional entrapment, because despite their radicalism, for all their radicalism, they remained largely bound by constitutional structures that were assumed unchallengeable, and which I think very much limited this group's political imagination and action. One example is that they never really challenged property relationships, which of course determined power distribution in England and to a very large extent keep determining power distribution in England. And so their desire to extend democracy could not really escape the sort of limits of capitalist rule, proto-capitalism, if you want, back then. And now, of course, it wasn't just the adherence to private property as a constitutional right, it was more generally a focus on constitutionalism, which, according to historians, very much obscured the diversity of their politics. For example, they re-articulated many of their radical ideas as questions of natural constitutional birthright. There are many examples of leveler leaders, of leader speeches of this group, where they attack social inequality on the basis of precisely that, the birthright of the English people to constitutional liberty and to equality. Now, for some legal theorists, including, I think the most famous must be Teubner, this is not merely a transfer, it's not merely a translation of political argument into legal argument, it is instead a reenactment of conflict, of political conflict as constitutional. It is, in other words, an appropriation of the political by the legal. And that's indeed so, I think, because as the political demand for social inequality was turning into a demand for constitutional entrenchment of a birthright, the levelers were jumping into legal territory. And when you jump into legal territory, the idea of social cleavages is always already ruled out. The idea, in other words, that people are born into unequal social positions is something that the law was structurally oblivious to in the 17th century, as it is structurally oblivious to today. The law in modernity does not see social classes, it sees equal subjects. What we have then here is that even for the levelers, the end result was that so long as the law ensured equal protection of all, and respected the natural birthright, the existing social order kind of remained unquestioned and unchallenged. And so for all their radicalism, they achieved very little, or little, I'm going to say, not very little, let's tone it down too much, in terms of radicalizing society through this focus on, patriotic constitutional thinking. My second example is from the 18th century, and we're talking now about a period of relative peace and normality. The Civil War is over, and so forth. But the genie of the people mobilizations is outside of the bottle after the Civil War. So the 18th century is the century that kind of sees political action outside of the confines of the parliament. And so this gradual disengagement of political action from the limits of parliamentary representation makes the establishment try to get back, try to restructure. And the establishment responds to this disengagement of political action from the parliament by launching the idea of public opinion. The emergence of extra-parliamentary action takes the forms of petitions, instructions, addresses, and so forth, and reveals to the establishment a need to, recontain whatever political energy was now unleashed by extra-institutional forces. And by 19th century, the idea of public opinion, although of course it never acquired formal constitutional status, however, it did dominate constitutional discourse, and it was invoked both by government and opposition, but not to welcome popular will as a new sort of constituent element, but on the contrary, to establish that it was a force that was already guiding political life. In other words, public opinion was portrayed by the establishment as the system's cause, the cause of political decisions, when in fact it was little more than a slogan invented by the very political system that it was supposed to be changing. And it was invented to contain exactly whatever forces, like I said, were possibly dangerous for established interests. This birth of the idea of public opinion goes hand in hand with another idea that is dominant in the constitutional history of England, and that is the idea that political conflict is to be exhaustively acted out in the House of Commons rather than in the broader social terrain, that politics and antagonism belong not to social classes, but to the parliament. And this effort to kind of contain antagonism in the House of Commons makes it very difficult not to think of those authors who have warned of the collapse of constituent power into representation and of the identification of constituent power with constituted power, the identification, in other words, of rulers and ruled, which basically is the opposite of populism. Why is it dangerous to identify rulers and ruled? I mean, to the extent that this is not obvious already, let's briefly look at the idea of constituent power. I'm going to use the theory of one of my favorite constitutionalists, Italian Tony Negri, and I'm going to very briefly try and present how he conceives constituent power. Negri sees constituent power as a material and ever-present body whose action is ontological in politics. This body is not pre-political, as, for example, advocates of liberal constitutionalism would argue, and indeed they have called this a populist idea. But this populist idea, is exactly the essence of politics. It is the essence of the continuous process we call politics. So constituent power is not a pre-political body. It is not the nation, but it is rather the unlimited, the unfinalized struggle to change the existing order of things. Constituent power is action. It is not the people as one, but instead an ongoing process of social antagonism. There is nothing metaphysical about this body. What instead gives rise to metaphysical intuition is, according to Negri, but also according to Rancière and others, the idea of representation. They, and I quote Negri, they argue that representation is a mystifying figure that controls and segments constituent power, denaturalizes it, disempowers it, and rearticulates it, not as the system's cause, but as the system's result. This fake rearticulation of result as cause is exactly the job that the idea of public opinion also performed. Now, this idea of constituent power as a force that's unbound by the contingency of constitutional and institutional boundaries of representation has been called populist by many polemics of so-called, constitutional populism. What do these theorists advocate instead? They say representation is a logical prerequisite to any claim to popular sovereignty. In fact, for this tradition of these pretty assertive disapprovers of populism, representation is constitutive of politics. Absent representation, they say, popular sovereignty risks becoming equivalent to the populist notion of constituent power as a body with a normative standing above the law, above the constitution, and so forth. And so they argue that constituent power is a populist concept. And my argument is great, because the supposedly anti-populist, responsible idea of liberal constitutionalists is deeply suspicious of any genuinely disruptive or transgressive ability of politics. It's a deeply, I think, conservative idea and denies precisely that which makes politics meaningful, namely the ability to change the established order of things. And it's not a coincidence that the political establishment of 18th century England invents the idea of public opinion to contain this force of constituent power within the institutional walls of the parliament and to therefore rule out any transgressive potential. By mid-18th century, the narrative of public opinion has become a pretty useful instrument to keep people obedient, and the idea has settled that political struggles are exclusively to be dealt with within the realm of the parliament. I'm saying, therefore, that English constitutional history shows that populists like Tony Negri and their vision of constituent power have a likely much more liberating potential than the non-populist visions of liberal constitutionalists. Now, my third and final example is taken from Victorian England, mid-1800s. And I'm going to talk a little about the Chartists, the group of radicals, of working class radicals that would be immediately denounced as populist today. I'm going to argue, though, that if the Chartists were more populist and less constitution oriented, they would have been more faithful to their cause, which was, of course, the emancipation of the working class. Now, for those unfamiliar, the Chartists are probably the most influential, probably the last big group of working class radicals in English history. And they were active, like we said, in the mid-19th century. In the interest of time, I'm going to compress a few historical incidents into a quicker narrative. We're in Victorian England, which was problematic in a number of respects. But at the same time, it was also a safe haven for foreign dissidents. Marx and Engels were there and so forth. They were hiding. And there were a lot of French emigres as well. Now, long story short, during the Crimean War of Napoleon against Russia, we have several incidents of Napoleon pushing the English government of Palmerston, was the prime minister then, to expel foreign refugees, mainly French dissidents, to try them, to punish them, and so forth. And so Queen Victoria and Palmerston, they both succumbed to Napoleon's will, and we have many instances of unfair trials, lack of due process, general violations of the rule of law against these French refugees and so forth. These legal violations bring the Chartists together with middle-class liberals, and they collectively argue for more respect for the law, more respect for the rule of law, and so forth. This becomes a very powerful movement that achieves very powerful victories. For example, Palmerston withdraws certain prosecutions under the public pressure and the fear that dissidents will be acquitted by the jury, and so forth. Now, the victory, or the victories in plural, serve to affirm a general kind of belief in the impartiality of state institutions, a general belief in a legal system that is responsive to just claims of the disadvantaged against the elite, in a parliamentary system that's capable of registering the needs and the desires of the people, and so on. And so the English legal system becomes elevated to a very high status. And in this manner, the national idiom, because it wasn't any legal system, it was the English legal system in particular, it was the inherited ancient constitution. So the national idiom of the Victorian era, but also the juridical idiom of the Victorian era, undercuts the language of class and encourages collaboration between the Chartists and the liberals. And this common reliance by these different social forces on the rule of law, on national constitutional doctrine, and so forth, comes as an appeaser of social conflict, and social conflict essentially gets suppressed. I believe that this de-radicalized the Chartists to a large extent, because later on, about 10 years later, it refacilitated suppression of rising class consciousness when the first trade unions started to appear. I'm coming to a close. What happened then is that the liberals, of course, feared that trade unions would remove social struggle away from the parliament. Again, this fear that social conflict will escape the walls of the parliament. So they feared that trade unionism would remove social struggle away from the parliament and re-articulate it as a struggle between classes. The class represented in the House of Commons and the class represented in trade unions. For the liberals, this was a huge danger. And I'm quoting from historical records, a really interesting statement that I think it's interesting that I found. It says this: a true statesman, it says, would rather drag the working man within the pale of the Constitution by force, so drag working men within the pale of the Constitution by force, than suffer working men to organize themselves into a separate community outside the Constitution. What does this tell us? It tells us, I think, that liberals were afraid of a populist style antagonism and in favor of a constitutional type of normality kind of consensus. And so with their focus on legal and institutional and constitutional normality, I think Chartists facilitated precisely this constitutional colonization of politics that brought about consensus and suppressed whatever social conflict was being unleashed. Now, to close, I feel like a populist rhetoric of sharp division would have been preferable from the point of view of the working class in all instances that I mentioned. That the rhetoric of social antagonism or even against established institutions can be much more political and can be much more beneficial to those oppressed and those disadvantaged than an argument that has the Constitution as its premise and as its ultimate aim, as its telos. I'm done.
Thank you very much, Maria. Yours too was a fascinating presentation. I have to say it is very innovative. It is you have presented us a non-liberal version of the oxymoron of the populist constitutionalism thesis, which is something I hear for the first time, and you practically deconstructed our whole research project, actually, which is a major challenge for us and something we thank you very much for. Now, there are some questions. I also have one question, but I leave it for later. Give the floor to the colleagues for their questions. Before I do, I have to say that this first panel was excellent. I enjoyed all three of the presentations. All three were very original. The colleagues presented the original ideas. They brought a fresh perspective on old questions. And in one way or another, all three have a critical approach to the topics they presented. Now, I'm afraid I didn't notice who raised hand first. So I give the floor for questions as I see them. First to Jason, then to Ifigeneia, then to Costas, Stratilatis, and then to the Allan Dreyer window, which I don't know which one of the three of you. It is Allan, okay. And if there's some time, I will make one final question too. And after we hear the questions or comments, I give a speech to all three presenters for a chance to answer or comment on what they have heard. So, Jason.
Thank you all for your presentations. They were really interesting and fascinating. I have two questions, one for Maria and another for Angus. To Maria, my question is that it is not clear to me why politics should be conceived as essentially disruptive, anti-establishment, and so on. I mean, we all know there is the politics of compromise, of beginning from diverse perspectives and reaching a common ground through discussion, compromise, and so on. So why it is essential, in your view, to understand politics in this way, to identify politics with strife? That's my question for Maria. And my question for Angus, according to those who proposed the creation of the Council of Censors, what were the guarantees that this institution would not be essentially a clone of the legislative power or any other elected body? This, in my understanding, this is also a check and balances thing. So I may have missed something, but I would like the clarification on that. Thank you very much.
Ifigeneia.
Thank you, the three of you. A question to Angus and some short thoughts on Maria's presentation. Angus, could elected constitutional courts be an answer to refresh representative democracy, to give life to the constitutional view of a democratic organization of power and guarantee to the Constitution? Maria, it was very interesting. I fully agree with you that the essence of politics is the omnibus disputandum est. But you dealt only with liberal constitutionalism. Besides liberal constitutionalism, and besides them who supported the full sovereignty of parliament, there is democratic constitutionalism. And there is this tradition we call popular constitutionalism, in which the organization of this struggle is the essence of the Constitution. And you erase this from your point of view. Erasing this appall of the Constitution, I'm afraid that you also dismiss the division between public and private sphere. And without a democratic constitutionalism, I'm very much afraid that we cannot have the sphere of people's sovereignty in which political struggles are developed. And without the democratic constitutionalism, I'm afraid that we open the door to the appropriation of politics from powerful interests, from powerful units. To close these short thoughts, I think we have to organize another workshop to discuss all these ideas. So to close these short thoughts, I'm afraid that devaluating constitutionalism would devaluate people's power. And I'm persuaded that we have to distinguish between the colonization of politics by constitutional law and the organization of politics by democratic constitutions. Thank
you. Costa.
Thank you for the wonderful presentations. They give food for thought. Angus, I wanted to stay a bit on Angus' idea, and I find it a very useful laboratory for our thoughts and imagination regarding populism. The Council of Censors. Of course, it was very soon abolished, but it managed to reach the French revolutionaries. And there were a handful of proposals within the constituent assemblies of the French Revolution. Sieyès was just one, and the most conservative, let's say, proposal. But there is a French theorist, Pierre Rosanvallon, who has analyzed, let's say, the common denominator of these ideas, and it is as if it is something lost to modern democratic imagination, a combination of oversight over governmental powers, vigilance. The citizen vigilance is a virtue, surveillance, also in a way a deliberative constituent power. This is another important pillar of this institutions. Also critique. These things in modern democracies, we have the press, we have opposition in parliament, but in revolutionary France, the tribunate, which was a watered down, let's say, version of the censor council, was abolished by Napoleon precisely on the grounds that if it was institutionalized opposition. This was the proto-populist. Napoleon abolished this thing. I believe that we should insist more on this fertile ground, because they point to a direction which is radically different from constitutional courts, as we know them, of course. And one point for Maria, I would ask her for a comment. Reading Negri's trilogy, in the last book, the closing pages, not only the closing pages, this book is a praise for Kant, surprisingly, and in the closing pages, he calls for constitutionalization of the revolution. It's not just a slogan. He's not Zizek. Negri, I don't find that this is by chance. He realizes that the politics of radical, let's say, impatience with constitutional forms does not lead easily to something else. Thank you.
Thank you, Costa. Allan, please.
Yeah, thank you for some extremely interesting presentations. I come to this debate about constitutions and constitutionalism from the outside. I'm schooled in politics and not in law. And I'm actually, so in a sense, this is a question to all the participants, because I find it a bit difficult to figure out what exactly is meant by constitutionalism, or to be a bit more precise, what is it that the distinction between constitution and constitutionalism does? So, and this might be really far-fetched, but listening to the presentations, I was thinking, I think I would have to go around your presentation, Maria, first, which I like very much, because in a sense, I agree that to some sense that the logic of a constitution is, in a sense, the opposite of the logic of at least the political. So it's a way of setting something, institutionalizing something. And yet, I would argue, we will argue tomorrow in our presentation, that any actual constitution is, of course, the result of power, exercise of power. It includes and it excludes. So there's always traces of power in a constitution, and we should not blind ourselves to that. But apart from that, and this is really an idea I developed while listening to your very exciting presentations, perhaps we could find some kind of the undecidability in the Constitution, that the impossibility of actually constitute the constituent power, codify it, and that is perhaps this undecidability, this eternal evocation of something which remains beyond, is what we are dealing with when we are talking about constitutionalism rather than constitutions. And in that sense, perhaps it's not so completely opposite to politics or the political, which would always also be conditioned on the possibility of a certain distance between ideals and reality, or we call it. Just some thoughts that I would very much like to hear your responses to. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Allan. These are very, very large questions. We need another conference on them, and we should probably. Bojan, we're very glad you're with us. Please.
Yeah, thank you. So I just want to congratulate all the three speakers. This was really fascinating and excellent discussion and contribution. But my comment will be very brief, mostly about Angus' contribution, which I found really also fascinating and extremely important for our current work and research and populism. And as you, Angus, pointed out, not only was this early founding of the American Republic, there was the question of the Guardian or Constitution contested, but this question remained open and contested throughout the American history. And paradoxically, it was actually very late in the history. It was the Warren Court and the Cold War liberalism which cemented this current vision, what Martin Laughlin calls in his book Constitutionalism. So I think this is very important endeavor, because if we enlarge it to comparative base, we see also, for example, in other parts of the world, like in continental Europe, in the early 20th century, there was only one constitutional court actually existing at that time, the Austrian one. It has very, very weak powers compared to current courts. And it was also in Europe, only in the post-World War II period that we saw the emergence of this different alternative model of constitutionalism, which is now represented as a normal, as a standard model. So there is a lot of reading history back and uncovering this different understanding. This is extremely important, extremely precious, and I just wanted to congratulate you on that work. Thank you.
Thank you, Bojan. Well, we're kind of late, but I should perhaps restrain myself, but I am tempted, and I won't actually. I have two short remarks, one for Mikkel's paper and one for Maria's, and a small question for Angus. Mikkel, what I found very, very interesting, fascinating indeed, is that you presented us a constitutional history of Denmark, which is kind of deviant of the mainstream or prevailing constitutional history of the large European nations. We are more familiar with like Germany or France or the Netherlands or even Italy or Spain. And this makes me wonder whether the European periphery, to which in one way or another the Nordic countries belong, but also the Balkan countries and Greece as well, tells us a different story of European constitutionalism. This is just a remark, it's not a question. Maria, another aspect that I forgot to mention before is that you present, and I think this is very original as well, you presented as the case for patriotism as an aspect of left-wing or working class populism, which, however, is destined to lead to one version or another of authoritarianism. This is a very powerful idea. I just mentioned it. It's not a question, and I think we should reflect on that more. Angus, my question is rather simple, and it is a different version of questions already posed by Jason and by Ifigeneia. The idea of the Council of Censors reminded me of the idea that the French philosopher de Tracy proposed a few years after that, in the early 19th century, of a fourth power or a fourth branch of government, the Corps Conservateur. It is more or less the same thing, with one difference. This Senate is elected, but it is elected for life. So my question is, I fully understand and I agree with your argument that this Council of Censors idea is a democratic alternative to the judicial enforcement of the Constitution. However, my question is, how different is actually the institution of the constitutional courts as we know it in the present time from these ideas of the Council of Censors or of the Corps Conservateur? Thank you. And well, now I give the floor to the three presenters, first to Angus, then to Mikkel, and last to Maria. Angus.
Yeah, thank you for some really fantastic questions, some of which really touch on what I'm working on and some of which have sort of provoked me to think about things I hadn't before. Just on Jason's first question, which is what is the difference between the censors and the legislature? What stops the censors from just becoming a sort of clone of the legislature? This is kind of, this was one of the important debates in Pennsylvania around the founding of this constitution. The whole idea is that this will be the guardian of the Constitution. It will stop abuses of power. And its critics, of course, come back with the perennial and, of course, ever important quip, well, who's watching the watchers? What stops this from just becoming the master of the Constitution itself? The thinking, as far as I can reconstruct it, and as I said in my presentation, there are some difficulties with this reconstruction because they did not take a record of the convention for whatever reason. As far as I understand it, the way they intended to do this was, one, through a slight differentiation of the principle on which the census was elected to the legislature, which was that the legislature was elected in districts within the counties, whereas the censors were elected by the entire county, which would elect two censors at once. The second was that the censor's actions were, of course, wholly negative. It couldn't make new laws. It could only strike down laws that actually existed. And in fact, there's some debate, there was considerable debate, in fact, as to whether it could strike down the laws itself, or if it merely had to order them to be struck down, and what that entailed, and whether that striking down was required, which in practice, because very few people respected this institution, meant that very few of the laws it asked to be struck down ever actually stopped being enforced. The other element was that all of it, wherever it had a creative power, if you will, it was only creative in the sense that it could summon a convention which could modify the constitution, and in fact could modify the constitution in whole, which again was a subject of debate as to whether it had to merely be amendments, but which everybody agreed, of course, de facto meant that it could change the constitution as a whole. So I think that's the biggest difference. As regards to whether it is just another check in a system of checks and balances, I think you could definitely say that on one interpretation. In the context of early American history, the term checks and balances has come to very specifically be used to refer to the kind of tripartite, lower chamber, upper chamber, executive division, and then more recently, as Bojan sort of indicated, to include the legislature, although this is kind of a reading back into 18th century constitutionalism of a 20th century idea. So that's why I refrained from using the term checks and balances to refer to it. And I think it's best seen as a check, but a check outside the system of checks and balances, because in fact, they're not particularly interested in a balanced constitution, so long as power of the constitution defaults to the people. What was the second question? The second question was from Ifigeneia. Could an elected constitutional court be an answer to some of our problems? I think there is a degree to which the answer is yes. As far as I know, there's only been one really substantive proposal for an elected constitutional court in Europe, at least. I may be missing one outside Europe or after whenever I learned this piece of information, which was in Bulgaria, and this was never implemented. And I think this was only a very briefly discussed idea at some time in the 20th century. And yeah, I think there is some case that you could resolve a lot of these problems with an elected constitutional court, but I also don't wonder why we don't go further than that if we're reforming these institutions. And I think if you're removing the explicitly judicial element of a constitutional court by making it elected, then I think that does demand some changes to the way it's structured. The Council of Censors, for example, and some of these similar institutions, which I'll turn to discuss in a second, were much larger. They had, 100 members or 200 members or something in that sort of ballpark. And it really became a site of debate about the constitution rather than a normal court where there is debate, but it's not a debating chamber, if that makes sense. And I think the other element that you might consider is changing how constitutional adjudication and the legal jurisdiction over the constitution might function. So as far as I understand it, again, the Council of Censors operated in some ways more like the French Conseil Constitutionnel, in the sense that it exercised an ex-ante review of the constitutionality of legislation. It couldn't go back and relitigate old points of law in that sense. But I think it is a somewhat fine distinction sometimes as to what the difference would be. And I would rather an elected constitutional court than what we currently have, even if I prefer a sort of more radical change. I think Costas's question and Akritas' final question are not quite the same, but on very similar topics. So I will combine them if that's okay. So actually, this is the subject of my PhD dissertation. I'm working on the idea of a third or fourth power as a kind of constitutional guardian before a constitutional court, particularly in the French Revolution, but looking to the American influence. Part of what I'm working on is actually considering how far we should consider Sayez's proposal as having been a bit more radical than we sometimes conceive of it as being. That's a different discussion for a different time. I could talk about that for the rest of the session, and nobody has the time for it. But yes, I mean, I agree that I think there is a whole tradition here which has been lost of surveillance and censorship of the constituted powers, which this third or fourth power tradition represented. And I think you both raise something which actually the way I initially became interested in this was reading the works of Destutt de Tracy, discovering something that looked rather like, say, as his constitutional jury, which in the English translation of this document, Thomas Jefferson actually originally compares to the Council of Censors. And that was how I became interested in the topic in the first place. And I think actually, I think it was Costas talked a little bit about Napoleon's destruction of the Tribune. I think this is one of my substantive breaks with Rosanvallon in what he writes about this subject, because I think he actually misses the extent to which it was already before the Constitution of the Year 8 had even been promulgated that these ideas were sort of attacked, betrayed, however you want to put it, by Napoleon. Because of course it was the Conservative Senate, which eventually became just a rubber stamp for Napoleonic power, which was supposed to be the original constitutional watchdog and is kind of the inheritor of the tradition inaugurated by the Council of Censors, although through a quite labyrinthine process. But I think the Conservative Senate is a good point, and I'll just end this answer on this point, is a good one to think about because it does represent the possible problems raised by this tradition, which is if you create a very powerful guardian of the Constitution, you have to be sure that it won't become the master of the Constitution itself. I think in the case of a lot of Supreme Courts, we can see that that is what's happened, especially in the United States. Then on Bojan's point, which I started, oh no, sorry, I missed Allan's question. Sorry, I will answer that. On the distinction between constitution and constitutionalism, again, I think this is one of the kind of very fundamental questions which a lot of us are addressing. I think part of what I was trying to show is that although and again, I will fall back on Martin Laughlin somewhat because I think he's given the best exposition of this recently. What has now come to be called constitutionalism often does cash out as a limitation of political power and the political as such. I think there is a case, as you suggested, for viewing the Constitution as a somewhat undecided and indeterminate, factor in political life, which is still available for us to change and remake as we see fit. I can't do that question justice. I'd need a lot more time to think about it, but I think it's a very thought-provoking one. And then finally, to get to Bojan's question, I agree with you. I think it's really important that we retrace the history of constitutionalism and the means by which it was previously thought of how a constitution could be enforced, what the role of the guardian of the Constitution is. And as you said, this idea that it's the constitutional court, that this very limiting counter-majoritarian and even counter-democratic institution is, by necessity, kind of one of the default elements of the architecture of political life, is very much a creation of the post-Second World War period, often created with the explicit aim of limiting democracy in some way, although rarely of, limiting democracy outright. And I think that, and this is something that's been brought up in the Q&A as well, some of these ideas about constitutional adjudication and guardianship we see in the past provide a laboratory for thinking beyond this model that we've inherited from the 20th century, and which in some ways does, I think, betray the ideas about constitution, constitutionalism, and constituent power on which it was founded. And I think I'll wrap up my answers there, but thank you all very much.
Excellent, thank you, Angus. Mikkel.
Well, thank you for your comments and questions. I think in terms of your comment about the European periphery, I think there's absolutely a point there. I think it's very interesting because I can certainly say that in Denmark, it's a lot of the modern constitutional history is determined by being a smaller country next to what turns into a major power. Isn't, of course, immediately. It's actually sort of some of the conflicts there that shapes the German Confederation into what it becomes later and so on. And this provide some of the shocks that leads to constitutional revision in Denmark. So that's quite interesting and could probably be connected to, I don't know, something like Peter Skocpol's theoretization of revolutions and so on, and how that comes to shape constitutional revision or a new constitution. So I think it'll be really interesting to look at commonalities in the periphery and how geopolitics affect these things, which we usually see in this very sort of narrow national perspective as a result of isolated political processes. So thank you. I'll look forward to look into that, and I hope we can talk more about that in the future. Then there's the question of the duality of, the constitution, if you will. That can be both sort of constituent power and constitution. I think it's very interesting, or I think now what I looked at here is quite interesting in Denmark. It's there is constantly like this play back and forth between sort of new political movements that attempt to affect how the constitution operates and who's included, who's excluded. But then there's just very poor constitutionalization of the results usually. Like it can be strongly institutionalized, but there is no sort of, or very few legal guarantees. It's more vested in the notion of an active people and associated practice. So it's like this political concept, to use Maria's vocabulary, I think. So even today, often when we teach constitutional law, you know how it is, we teach them, here it says king, but you have to read it as government. This is not how, constitutionalism is usually considered, but this is how it works, because it's so taken to be for granted and underpinned by sort of a notion that is fundamentally political, and what I'd argue is sort of an in-betweenness in terms of how this is read. So the law is actually politicized in that sense, even in its common practice. So I hope that goes somewhere towards answering Allan's question. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mikkel. And Maria.
Thank you, Akritas. What a shame that Ifigeneia just left, because I was making notes as the questions were going, and my notes are literally all over the place. So hopefully I will make sense. I'm going to ask with I'm going to start, not ask, with Ifigenia's points, just in case she's still around. I think she's making a very valid point, and kind of the $1 million question kind of thing. And it's not like I wasn't expecting a question to the effect of, okay, so what are you suggesting? Are you suggesting that we abandon the Constitution altogether? And of course, my question is not necessarily, no, I'm not suggesting that, but what I want to point out is that the Constitution, the liberal democratic Constitution of capitalism, is a document and a legal field that constitutes an economic reality. It perceives the people as a uniform unit because they are subject to the same political rights, and in denying economic inequalities, it makes the economic claims of one particular class universal. And so, no, I'm not a massive fan of the idea of a constitution in general. Ifigeneia also mentions this division of the public and the private, and she said that she feels like my contribution kind of does not do justice to that distinction. And again, I don't necessarily have a straightforward answer, but I want to counter a question to that, which would be, why do we always assume that the separation of the public from the private is such a good thing? Because this separation sort of compels us as humans to kind of lead a double sort of life as a citizen and as a private individual. And this means that political freedom is separated from economic dependence and from exploitation. And this separation leads to citizens being unequal partners in popular sovereignty. So again, I'm not sure I am a great fan of the separation of the public and the private, at least, you know, in an unqualified way. Of course, I cannot argue credibly against constitutions in general because I don't have a great alternative, but I argue for democratizing the constitution, and democratizing the constitution, I think, would mean to recognize precisely that abstract political rights are embedded into unequal social structures. Show me the constitution that does that, and I will wholeheartedly, you know, embrace it. Now, on the sorry if I forget your name, it's the Danish group question on, I think Angus has already responded on the constitutionalism distinction, but just to very briefly mention, my thought went to Lachlan as well, and he has basically I haven't caught up with his current work, but back in the day he has defined constitutionalism as the political theory that accompanies the constitution. In other words, as the theory of limited government. I would go a little further than that and describe constitutionalism in my understanding as well, at least, as a kind of general state of social consensus, a general state of reconciliation of competing interests in the society, something that is enabled by the constitution, because the constitution always creates a trade-off between those dominant and those dominated. And that also brings me to your question about, you know, doesn't the constitution also enable politics in some respects? Of course, constitutions sanction real rights to real people because they are very often the results of, you know, political struggles, political confrontations, and so forth, and they reflect the outcome of, you know, social and political struggles, of the class struggle, if you want to talk in Marxist terms, and so forth. Of course, this reflection of the class struggle is never 100% faithful. I think the question here is, does the Constitution really enable or empower communities? Because every right that is sanctioned in liberal constitutions is countered by an opposite right. I don't know, take the Greek constitution as an example, which makes it which creates a constitutional right to work, but also I think the Greek constitution also has constitutionalized we have constitutionalized the right to strike. Greek constitutionalists correct me if I'm wrong. But then you also have constitutional protections of economic liberty. You have constitutional protections of the right to property. Of course, these things clash with one another. Take it to the court and tell me what the court will decide. So it's always a matter of, you know, in what context is a constitutionalism created, read, but also interpreted. And so, yes, they do sanction real rights, but how they're actually going to work in practice depends on a million different things. On the question of, you know, why is politics essentially disruptive? Jason, I think it was you, and you mentioned this phrase, why not the politics of compromise? I don't know, but this phrase does not really resonate with me. I don't really understand it. And that could be because I have been reading a lot of Jacques Rancière lately, like I said, and I'm kind of, you know, I kind of can't think outside these terms. So Rancière uses this idea of dissensus not as disagreement, but dissensus as the idea of breaking with everything that is sensible, with everything that makes sense to us. So that breaking with this identification with everything that our minds are kind of programmed to make sense of means precisely that, rupture. So to me, in my mind, the way I'm used to understanding the idea of politics. If politics is not about rupture, then we're doing away with politics to court in a way. There's no politics unless it is conflictual, antagonistic politics. And I've left Costas's question for the end because it's the one that I can't respond to. I think I subconsciously lost you when you were asking the question, because I knew from the very beginning that I wouldn't be able to respond to it. You caught me very unprepared here. I haven't caught up with the work of Negri. As a matter of fact, I'm familiar with the work of Negri when he was part of Italian operaismo in the 60s and 70s. And this was a bunch of crazy Italian communists who were arguing against the idea of work and so forth. So this is the Negri that I'm more familiar with. I'm not familiar with his current work. So, unashamedly, I can't respond to the question you asked. And I'm really sorry for that.
Thank you very much, Maria. Well, as I have the privilege of the closing word, I know I'm not supposed to say this, but I can't help it. I have to say that I find this first day of our workshop as a huge success. That was one of the most intense 2.5 hours I've been part of, with brilliant ideas storming around. We had 4 superb presentations and very lively and to the point discussion. And this is very promising for the second day of our workshop tomorrow. As you have seen from the program, there are some very interesting papers to be presented then. I thank you all very much, both the discussants, both the panelists and the discussants, and of course the people that were watching. And I really do hope, guys, that we have soon the opportunity in the future to exchange ideas in other contexts. And I believe that's the point of these kind of events, to get to know each other and have the opportunity to test our research on a very competent and strict audience. And I hope we have succeeded in this today. I wish you all a good evening and a nice weekend, and hopefully we meet most of us today as well. Goodbye to all, and until tomorrow. Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Have a nice evening.